The year was 1970, and Detroit already smelled like something was ending. Not the city had been burning since '67 and had learned to live with the ash. What was ending was something quieter and more personal. The unspoken agreement between Marvin Gaye and the machine that had made him a star. Motown Records, that sleek, relentless hit factory on West Grand Boulevard, had spent nearly a decade turning black pain into palatable pop, packaging heartbreak into 3-minute singles that white radio stations would actually play. Berry Gordy had built an empire on control. Control of image, control of sound, control of what his artists were and were not allowed to say into a microphone. And for most of those years, Marvin had played along. He had smiled for the cameras, sung the love songs, worn the suits, and kept the darkness to himself. But by 1970, Marvin Gaye was sitting in his home studio with a collection of recordings that Motown was never supposed to hear. And one of the first people to hear them wasn't Berry Gordy, it was Stevie Wonder. Stevie was 20 years old that year, a prodigy who had grown up inside the Motown system the way some children grow up inside a church. It was the language he spoke, the only world he fully trusted. He had been signed at 11, had his first hit at 13, and understood Motown's rules not as limitations, but as the water he swam in. When Marvin called him and said he had something to play for him, Stevie came without hesitation. They were friends, real friends, the kind forged in recording studios and tour buses, and the particular loneliness of being famous inside a building full of people who needed something from you. Marvin trusted Stevie's ears. More than that, he trusted Stevie's honesty, because Stevie had no reason to lie to him. What Marvin played for him that afternoon was not a single. It was not even a collection of singles. It was something Motown had no category for, a suite of interconnected songs about war, poverty, ecological collapse, and the suffocating grief of watching a country devour itself. Marvin had written it in the wreckage of personal catastrophe. His duet partner and closest friend Tammy Terrell had died in March at 24. His brother Frankie had come home from Vietnam with nightmares he couldn't name, and the streets of Detroit still bore the scorch marks of a rebellion that nobody in power had bothered to understand. The album was called What's Going On, and when the last note faded and the tape hissed into silence, Stevie Wonder sat very still for a long moment. Then he said, "Marvin, if you put this out, Motown is going to bury you." He didn't say it cruelly. He said it the way a friend tells you that the road you're about to drive is flooded, not to stop you from going somewhere, but because he genuinely does not want to watch you drown. Stevie knew what Gordy's response would be. He had watched the machine chew through artists who stepped out of line, had seen careers quietly derailed when someone got too political, too strange, too honest. Motown's genius was also its violence. It protected you as long as you stayed inside its borders, and it erased you the moment you didn't. Stevie believed what he was telling Marvin. Every instinct he had, every year of institutional knowledge, told him that What's Going On was career suicide dressed up as art. The evidence was everywhere if you knew where to look. Motown had already demonstrated its appetite for control in ways both visible and quiet. Artists who pushed back on song assignments found their release schedules suddenly delayed, indefinitely. Those who spoke publicly about politics found themselves eased towards softer material, handed lyrics that said nothing, surrounded in the studio by producers whose job was as much management as music. The label had a gift for making erasure feel like collaboration, for turning silence into something that looked, from the outside, like creative choice. Stevie had watched it happen to people he respected. He had learned to navigate it with a kind of disciplined patience, biding his time, building his credibility, waiting for the moment when his leverage would be undeniable. What Marvin was proposing was the opposite of patience. It was a detonation. "They'll shelve it," Stevie said. "You won't see a release date, and then they'll start giving your sessions to someone else." Marvin listened. He let Stevie finish. And then he said something that Stevie would carry with him for the rest of his life. Something he only repeated in interviews decades later, long after the wound had become a lesson. "If I don't put this out, I'm already buried." Stevie left that afternoon, still convinced that Marvin was making a catastrophic mistake. He wasn't dismissing the music. He knew it was extraordinary, could hear in every bar the kind of weight that doesn't come from craft alone, but from a man being cracked open and deciding to let people see inside. But extraordinary music and commercially viable music were two different things at Motown, and Stevie had never seen Gordy choose art over revenue. He drove back through Detroit genuinely afraid for his friend, certain that he had just heard a masterpiece that would never see daylight, and that Marvin, in his grief and his fury, had signed his own professional death warrant. What happened next is the part the music industry still has trouble fully reckoning with. Marvin brought the album to Berry Gordy, and Gordy's response was exactly what Stevie had predicted: swift, dismissive, and laced with the particular condescension of a man who has been right about enough things to stop listening carefully. Gordy reportedly called it the worst thing I ever heard and refused to release it. He told Marvin it had no singles, no commercial hook, no identifiable audience. He told him it was too political, too strange, too far outside what Motown's radio relationships could support. There were conversations in back offices, advisors counseling Marvin to be reasonable, to give Gordy a version of the album that could be sold, a shorter version, a safer version, a version with the edges sanded down until it could slide past radio programmers without catching on anything. Marvin heard all of it. He sat through the meetings. He let the machine make its case. And then he told them in the language of the music business that it did not exist. But Marvin Gaye had stopped being afraid of the machine sometime around the moment Tammy Terrell stopped breathing. He went back to Gordy and delivered an ultimatum so clean it had the quality of inevitability. Release what's going on, or he would never record another song for Motown. Not a renegotiation, not a compromise. A door, open on one side only. Gordy, who had never lost an asset the way he was about to lose one, blinked. The album was released in May 1971. Within weeks, it had sold over 2 million copies. Within months, it had rewritten the acceptable vocabulary of soul music permanently. Stevie Wonder heard it on the radio for the first time while riding in a car through Detroit. He knew the songs already, had heard them in raw form in Marvin's studio, but hearing them finished, sequenced, released into the world was a different experience entirely. He later described that moment as the one where he understood something had shifted, not just in Marvin's career, but in what music was allowed to be. The machine had released something it didn't understand, and the world had understood it immediately, had grabbed it with both hands, had wept into it and been held by it and played it until the grooves wore thin. And Stevie Wonder, 20 years old and more honest than most people twice his age, went back to his own notebooks and started asking different questions. He would later say, in an interview from 1975, by which point he had released Inner Visions and Fulfillingness's first finale and was building towards Songs in the Key of Life, that What's Going On was the album that gave him permission. Permission to go deeper, to refuse the easy hook, to treat an album as a complete statement rather than a delivery mechanism for singles. He said it slowly, choosing the words carefully, the way people do when they're describing something that rearranged them. I had told Marvin he was making a mistake. What he was actually doing was showing me the door. The door, not a metaphor for opportunity, a literal threshold between what black music had been allowed to be inside the Motown system and what it could become when someone was willing to stand at the border and refuse to turn back. What makes this story more than a footnote in music history is what it reveals about the nature of creative courage and about the particular cruelty of being right too soon. Stevie was not wrong about the risk. Gordy's rejection was real. The possibility that the album would be shelved was real. Every calculation Stevie made that afternoon was accurate. What he couldn't calculate was the thing that can't be calculated. What happens when a piece of art is so precisely true that the market has no choice but to absorb it? What happens when the language of a song is so close to what people are already feeling, so exactly shaped to a grief they haven't been able to name, that commercial logic becomes irrelevant? Marvin Gaye knew something in 1970 that took the rest of the industry years to learn, that audiences were not waiting to be told what they could handle. They were waiting for someone to trust them with the full weight of reality. What's Going On did not succeed in spite of its seriousness. It succeeded because of it, because it treated its listeners as people with interior lives complex enough to hold a song about Vietnam and a song about ecological collapse and a song about the mercy of God all in the same breath. Berry Gordy understood this eventually. He would later call What's Going On the greatest album Motown ever released, a reversal so complete it almost requires a second listen to absorb. The man who called it the worst thing he'd ever heard and the man who declared it Motown's masterpiece were the same man, separated by the evidence of a world that had voted with its hands and its tears. Stevie Wonder's reckoning was more private and in some ways more lasting. He didn't announce that he had been wrong. He simply changed. The music he made in the years after What's Going On carried a new gravity, a willingness to sit inside discomfort rather than resolve it on the listener's behalf. He began negotiating his own creative independence from Motown, insisting on total artistic control, refusing to deliver the predictable product. He won those negotiations in part because of what Marvin had proven, that an artist who was trusted completely could generate something the machine could never have manufactured on its own. The conversation between Marvin and Stevie on that afternoon in 1970 is not in any official record. No one set up a microphone. No publicist issued a statement. It exists only in the account Stevie gave years later, careful and precise, a man measuring how much of someone else's story was his to tell. But the shape of it is legible in everything that followed. In the music both men made, in the way soul music expanded its own sense of what it was allowed to say, in the long, slow unraveling of the Motown model as its artists one by one claimed the right to make work that could not be easily sold. Marvin Gaye did not live long enough to see the full inheritance of that afternoon. He died in 1984, one day before his 45th birthday, in a house full of unfinished things. But What's Going On survived him the way very few albums survive their makers. Not as a museum piece or a historical artifact, but as a living document, something people still reach for when the world stops making sense. When the question in the title is not rhetorical but desperate. Stevie Wonder was at the funeral. He sang. And somewhere in that moment was the entire weight of a conversation that had taken place 14 years earlier. A warning that turned out to be an invitation, a prediction of failure that became the blueprint for everything that mattered. Have you ever had to fight a whole system just to show them your true soul? Tell us your story in the comments.